Welcome everyone. I'm just going to get started. We've got about 247 people already on, and we're expecting over, I think 525 people have signed on to this event, which I couldn't be prouder about. So you have got a real treat lined up for you. We've got amazing speakers who are going to basically give you an introduction to the whole housing approach and the toolkit, and then hot off the press we have the evaluation, which was actually published yesterday, so please make sure that you have a look at them in your own time. Like I said, this project has been a culmination of just so many partners and so many people coming together and thinking about the needs of survivors and the differing needs of survivors around housing, and what we could do collectively to really innovate and think about whole housing. I obviously want to say thank you to our funders, which is MHCLG. They first of all funded us for 18 months and then for an extra year, and we're halfway through that second year. This project has been a huge group effort in terms of second tier organisations and frontline services coming together to really challenge our thinking around whole housing and what we can do in order to support survivors and children, but also hold perpetrators to account. We're going to have a look at housing throughout the whole day in terms of how it fits within a coordinated community response, which is what Standing Together, have pioneered for over 20 years. This couldn't have been done, I'm going to labour this so much, but without the partnerships. And I have to say this partnership, although there's been so many partners, has just been incredible in terms of the work that we've been able to do together and the impact that we've been able to make. This session is going to be recorded, and also the PowerPoints will be available if you want to, forward them on or tell other people about this. There is a chat function. We will be putting sort of links in there, but because of the size of the event and how many people we've got speaking, and also just resource wise we won't be able to answer all of the questions that you put in the chat. However, we did send out a link for people to give some questions. We're going to be taking them back to the partnership board. We've also got a feedback survey that we're sending out at the end, because we really want to hear from you. Now we've got almost 300 people on this call that will have other things that they want to contribute or things that they know about that happening, and we really want to hear about that. Please use the whole housing hashtag throughout the event. Let's try and get it trending, and also we've got our own account at Whole Housing, which you would have seen at the beginning on the agenda if you came in, and I think that's it for me. I am going to turn over to our first speaker, who is Caroline from Standing Together, and she an introduction to the whole housing project and the toolkit. Caroline? Here she is. Hi,
thank you, Guddy. I'm going to try and share my screen now, everyone. Just bear with me a minute. It's great to be here today. There we go, and make that into presentation mode. Yeah. Okay, so as Guddy said, I'm working for Standing Together now, and I am the whole housing programme manager for Cambridgeshire. And this morning, I'm just going to give you a brief introduction into the whole housing approach. As I'm sure we can all agree, safe and stable housing is a core need for everyone. And this couldn't be more true for people experiencing domestic abuse, where home, sadly, is often the most dangerous place. And yet there are a significant number of barriers for victim survivors, including their children, which makes it a challenge to access safe accommodation when it's needed most. Since 2014, Domestic Abuse Housing Alliance has been working with housing providers across the country to upskill them and bring housing into the domestic abuse arena. We know that domestic abuse is one of the leading causes of women's homelessness. All too often, the perpetrator remains in the home, consequence-free, while victim survivors and their children are forced to flee, ending up homeless, all too often losing their tenancy. It's the victim survivors and society that pay the price both emotionally and financially. In 2018, Guddy, in her role as DAHA co-founder, formed the National Housing and Domestic Abuse Policy Group. This group brings together extensive knowledge from system leaders across the domestic abuse and housing sectors, which includes leading national services such as Women's Aid, Surviving Economic Abuse, Safe Lives, Respect, and then whole housing organisations such as Shelter, Crisis, Chartered Institute of Housing and the National Housing Federation. It was this group that conceptualised the whole housing approach. They understood that we need to have a more holistic view to domestic abuse, that not only do we need a strong response to domestic abuse in social housing, but in fact, over 80% of the population lives in privately owned and privately rented housing, and essential to respond to the housing needs of all survivors if we are to start to fully address the injustice experienced as a result of the expectations that survivors leave their homes across all tenure types. The whole housing approach endeavours to improve housing options and outcomes so that every individual, regardless of their tenure, their identity or access needs, can have safe and stable housing. The approach acknowledges that survivors may need to relocate for safety reasons, but they may be able to stay in their existing home if provided with the necessary support and interventions. When faced with homelessness, there is an emphasis on refuge services as the main housing option for women and children to escape a dangerous perpetrator. Refuge is a vital lifeline for women and children, but as a result of chronic underfunding and therefore the resulting lack of capacity, sadly, last year, over 60% of referrals had to be declined. Whole housing recognises the need for survivors to have multiple pathways to access safe accommodation. Refuge is a vital lifeline for many survivors, and the importance of the continued existence and funding of refuges must not be underestimated. In addition, we need options for survivors who don't feel that refuge is the correct housing pathway for them. We need to ensure that we are supporting all women and children who experience domestic abuse and that we are holding perpetrators to account. We need to ensure that we are providing services for people who experience multiple disadvantage and those with protected characteristics. It is important to acknowledge that victim survivors and their children have a range of different needs that can be met more successfully by offering multiple housing pathways. As you may be aware, the new Domestic Abuse Bill is making its way through Parliament, and local authorities will have a new duty relating to the provision of safe accommodation under this bill. It is essential that as we now plan for this new duty, local authorities design into their needs assessments a range of housing solutions meeting these differing needs. We are going to be closely following the government on this, and we encourage local areas to plan for this duty within the context of a whole housing approach. The MHCLG funded us and our partners to pilot the whole housing approach in 3 different regions, and you will hear much more about this during the course of the event. Experts in their areas, the leaders of this pilot, developed the whole housing toolkit based on their expertise, experiences, and learning in carrying out this groundbreaking work. This toolkit is available online to support in planning with your work around the new duty. The bill presents us with an opportunity to make lasting changes to the lives of survivors, which directly address the injustice they currently face every day in relation to their housing, with the aim of preventing homelessness and the postcode lottery for survivors. Adopting a whole housing approach in your region will allow you to do this most effectively. It embodies the coordinated community response that incorporates statutory and voluntary sectors with domestic abuse specialist services at its core, ensuring that services work together to keep victim survivors safe and also encourages agencies to hold perpetrators to account. Recent figures show that 76% of domestic homicides happen in the home. We know that housing is a huge barrier to survivors leaving an abusive relationship. The whole housing approach seeks to address this by ensuring survivors have access to a range of housing options and initiatives. The benefits of embedding a whole housing approach in your region mean earlier identification of domestic abuse through mobilising social and private landlords and key institutions in private ownership. With survivors accessing support earlier, you will see a reduction in potential harm and therefore in domestic homicides. There will be an increase in tenancy sustainment. The support options allow survivors who wish to do so, and when it is safe to do so, to remain in their own homes. Should this not be an option, relocation is necessary. Initiatives such as the managed reciprocal can prevent the loss of tenancy status for survivors. Whole housing offers the provision of a suite of options for survivors, so they have multiple pathways to help them successfully exit an abusive relationship. The diagram here illustrates the 12 components of the whole housing approach. It's important to say at this point that this is still being developed. We are working with our partners and continually growing and developing these solutions. The model that we see, particular areas, perpetrator management, that we work and continue to try and develop and have better solutions around this. We will also be creating another component around move on, which is it's been highlighted in the duty as a safe accommodation that needs to be considered. So the light green circles here represent the housing tenure types. This includes refuge, privately rented and privately owned homes. It also includes supported housing and social housing for survivors. The dark green circles represent the initiatives and options to help survivors maintain safe accommodation. These include the specialist domestic abuse services, such as mobile and co-located advocates, and all important domestic abuse coordination. This also includes the Housing First initiatives. Some of these initiatives, such as the Sanctuary Scheme, have been in existence for some time in your locality. Some are newer, such as the flexible funding, which is a pot of money that survivors can access to flexibly remove financial barriers, for example, by clearing coerced debts from the perpetrator or helping to set up a new home. These initiatives are still being developed, but the point is we need to keep working together on these, especially as we start to do more work in the private rented and privately owned sectors. We will be continuing to develop new initiatives in these areas, and working together, we will create better responses to meet the diversity of needs of survivors that are inclusive of protected characteristics, those with multiple disadvantage, and those with no recourse to public funds. In addition to all this, we are currently developing the chapter in our toolkit about move on properties. Thank you all for listening. I will leave it here, as you will be hearing from our amazing experts who will provide you with in-depth information into the components they have been working so hard on over the last 18 months. In addition, I encourage you to look at our toolkit chapters, which provide detailed expert guidance on resources on each of these components and how to implement them in your region. I hope you enjoy the rest of the session. We are now going to go directly to our video, which is 4 different survivors talking about some of their experiences in different tenures, including private rented, private home ownership, social housing and refuge accommodation. Thank you for listening.
I spent 10 years saving up to buy a flat. He moved in even though I didn't want him to. Things changed, I think, when he saw me come to the point where I was ready to end the relationship. And that's when he came in with marriage proposals. Once we were engaged, then he was very pushy about getting his name on the mortgage and the deed. For 2.5 years, I fought to defend myself through the legal system, in between trying to hold down a job, which I ended up failing to do, and continue to battle legally with my perpetrator. It was a lot of work, and preparing and providing that legal evidence is a full-time job. I almost lost it to my perpetrator, and then almost lost it to the bank because I couldn't keep up repayments, because I couldn't work, and I couldn't work because I was battling my perpetrator. So it's this vicious cycle. I tried so many times to get legal aid, and it was really inaccessible. I think partly because I was a homeowner. Even when I lost my job, so I'd been signed off sick with PTSD, I was still unable to access any legal aid. You have the abuse from the perpetrator, the economic abuse from the perpetrator, and then you have the systemic abuse. And there's no difference in how that feels, what that's like to experience. It is like being ganged up on by an entire system. And when I say system, I think it's important to really list that we're talking about the police, and we're talking about the banks, and we're talking about the financial ombudsman, we're talking about the legal system in the wider general sense of the word. It felt like the system completely supported my perpetrator and completely fell short of supporting me, and also failed at any point to recognise domestic abuse, even in general, as any significant part of the situation. Every system, including things like universal credit, view you as a homeowner as somebody that is fine, that is doing okay, that they're not at risk because they own a home, they are in a fortunate position and they're in a privileged position. They don't see you as a person in need. It's like you're on a separate list of you are void from any kind of support because you have a home. It completely goes against you. It's like being blacklisted.
Day where I left, he had taken my house keys out of my bag while I had been hiding upstairs with the kids away from him. So he gave me the opportunity to leave, but we were both on the private tenancy at that house. We had been there since January 2012. I'd gone to my sister's. I didn't know how long for. The police did come and talk to me the following day, and they gave me the option of pressing charges. They said that in their view, what he did qualified as common assault. I had to decide what to do about the property that we had a joint tenancy on. My husband was dangling in front of me the idea that he would move out of our joint tenancy property. If the tenancy agreement changed into just my name, I would be able to claim housing benefit, which would mean that kids' housing would be secure. I have the option to find another private landlord and get help with a deposit scheme and a grant for the first month's rent. And I think that's quite useful to know that that was an option, because it helps me have boundaries with him without feeling like I had to accept moving back into what had been our joint home. So I kind of felt like if I moved back to our 3-bedroom place that we rented from a private landlord, I would be vulnerable both to the fact that private landlords put the rent up as and when they wish. I would be in a home that he was familiar with and that he felt was his territory. The Refuge outreach worker spoke to the housing association. The housing association spoke to the local authority, came back and said, yeah, they're happy for you to move local authority areas into their area. It made a massive difference, and it is easier when you're in a normal home environment to make things appear normal to your children so that they're not re-traumatized even more. That was a big part of what the outreach worker did, was just let me process. These are the controlling aspects of it. This is recognizable to other people. It's not in your head. You know, the turning point for me was knowing that I wasn't crazy. That's been a huge thing.
I personally experienced years of domestic violence, which also included stalking and harassment. Housing Advice supported me through the Pan-London housing transfer. They liaised with housing officers, social workers, and supported me through the merit process. I was previously referred to the sanctuary scheme. I found the process really helpful. It kept me and my son safe. Once I was referred, the process moved quickly. I was high risk at the time. The safety measures were put in place in my home, which included securing doors, windows, and making it a safe place to remain. I felt the process was smooth and really helped me feel secure and safe in my home for me and my son.
My husband was not well by mind, and he was patient depression, and he got criminal cases, but I don't know about that before. Then he started threatening me, and with the knife, with the gun, and every day it's like killing me, and it's a very horrible situation for me. That's why I left that house. I was very scared from them. My cousin report to police and they come to save me. They sent me in a mixed refuge, and it was very scary for me because I was never used to live with the unknown persons, male persons. When I came here, I was happy that only ladies here. They helped me to register in a GP. They helped me to go to a bank card. They helped me for my visa. They helped me for my college. I start life here. I feel very safe here, and I am very happy here. I was very weak by mind, by heart, but you people, you make me strong. Every day you make me strong. When I got headache, you help me. You help me for good words and everything. I got it, and I am strong now, alhamdulillah. So thank you so much. Thank you so much, and love you so much.
So that really says it all in terms of 4 different experiences of trying to navigate through the housing system. Some really positive, and then also some showing the complete sort of gaps that exist in terms of like trying to get support in terms of legal aid. Just wanted to say a huge shout out to Sandra, who put that video together for us, because that's amazing on top of her day job. So just wanted to say that. And Caroline, thank you very much for that really comprehensive overview of whole housing. I'm now going to move over to Rebecca, who's staying together, who's another whole housing programme manager, who's going to talk about some of the findings and impact from the project.
Hi, hello, thank you, Guddy, and hello, everybody. It's fantastic to be here and to see you all here. So I'm Rebecca, I'm the programme manager for the London site, and I work closely with the project leads in our other pilot sites in Stockton-On-Tees and in Cambridgeshire. And as Caroline said, the idea of whole housing was born at the National Group, and it really came to fruition in the last 2.5 years. We've been working with an excellent partnership group who you can see here, that we developed really the whole housing approach from concept to delivery. And so in partnership working with 6 expert domestic abuse services, including 3 delivering frontline services on the ground to survivors in our project sites, and the other 3 delivering capacity building and development support, in specifically focusing on the tenure types, and also then looking at working with a civil society organisation on delivering the sanctuary scheme, and then also working with 10 local authorities. Sorry, I'm just going to check that I'm okay. All right. Sorry, okay, I think you can see. Right, so yeah, we've been delivering this in partnership with expert services to get this project off the ground. And today I'm going to focus, so we've been working together for 2.5 years, but today I'm going to focus on the first 18 months of the project, which is featured in our first year pilot report that came out yesterday. And this includes a combination of, like, as Caroline mentioned, we have 12 components to the whole housing approach, and we were funded to deliver 8 of those components, with generous thanks to the Ministry of Housing for funding this work in this very first pilot. We had a combination of capacity building and development work that started off really with the coordination of the project, which looked at each of the project sites and involved mapping and scoping what the response was in terms of housing in each of those pilot sites. And we worked together, each project lead, to bring our partnership together in terms of the whole housing team, and then also looking at who it was on the ground in those project sites in housing that we needed to be working with. We worked with our expert capacity building partners to look at each of the tenure types. So we worked, so DAHA, the Domestic Abuse Housing Alliance, focused specifically on working with the private rented sector and looking at social housing. And we offer an accreditation system, as some of you will be familiar with, to social housing providers. Our expert partners, Surviving Economic Abuse, focused working in the privately owned sector, and they also shared their expertise on economic abuse. We worked with Safer London, who set up the Pan-London Reciprocal Scheme and really put a focus on supporting survivors to retain their secure tenancies instead of having to give those up if they have to leave their homes. We also did some work looking at perpetrator management and how we could actually be holding perpetrators to account, where housing providers have a lot of power to be able to do this and a lot of legal tools to their avail, but how are they actually using those, and how can we encourage them to use them more effectively? We also delivered a series of frontline services to survivors, and that's highlighted in purple here. And so we have, starting with the domestic abuse services that offered mobile advocacy. And this is really a form of outreach support, similar to an independent domestic violence advocate, and IDVA, as we heard mentioned earlier by one of the survivors. This kind of support is designed to work flexibly to meet survivors at a location of their choosing, whether that be in the community and sometimes in their own home, and to start supporting them with whatever it is that they wanted support with in relation to helping them secure and safe and stable housing. This was also combined with a co-located advocacy service. Sorry, this is also in addition to a co-located advocacy service. And this particular one was delivered within a local authority housing department in our London sites. It might also be delivered within another housing service, such as a housing association. But what they did in this particular project is that they saw survivors coming through their doors who were fleeing and were presenting as homeless because of reasons of domestic abuse. And they offered direct support to those survivors, telling them about what their housing rights were, what the housing options were available to them, and also offering them much needed, you know, safety, planning support, emotional support, and building that trust and relationship with them, and offering some independent advocacy support. Alongside that, they also supported their colleagues within housing and brought some education and awareness raising about domestic abuse, and also offered some support with their own cases, so guided and offered some information kind of as to how they could support their own survivors that they were supporting. We then, alongside that, offered flexible funding. So domestic abuse services, in particular the mobile advocates and co-located advocates, had access to flexible funding, which is a new innovative intervention offered through the whole housing approach. That is a pot of funding that is literally there to be used flexibly for survivors to access, to be able to help them access secure housing as quickly as possible. So a lot of, yes.
Really quickly, we can't see your screen. So, and I know you've got a survivor journey coming up and you need it. So I thought I'd quickly butt in and tell you. It's all right, these things happen, it's technology, you can never rely on it totally.
Okay, can you see that now?
Yes, it's starting to share now, that's perfect.
Oh, brilliant. I apologise about that, everyone, because it must have been
no need to apologise, it happens to the best of us.
Great, so as you can see here, we've got the 3 project sites and we've got the components that we delivered in each of those sites. And so just to kind of come back to flexible funding, this pot of funding, and in my opinion, this is probably one of the most powerful components that we had in the intervention of the whole housing response, because it really did address some of the practical needs that survivors have in being able to access stable housing. And this is often as a result of the perpetrator's abuse and depleting access to their economic resources, either getting them into debt or preventing them from being able to leave and be economically independent, essentially. So what this flexible funding was used for was to support survivors to either remain in an existing accommodation with the support of the funds to clear off debts, or it was used to help them to relocate, so to literally pay for moving costs or to pay for a rent deposit and to pay for household items, to buy white goods, to make a house a home, essentially. And many of the survivors that were supported through this said that without those funds, they wouldn't have been able to leave the perpetrator. They would have either ended up homeless or they would have ended up remaining with that perpetrator, being subject to ongoing abuse. And so this is, we think, a really vital part and component. And the advocates that were giving out flexible funding also noted that this was a huge opportunity for them to feel good in their role, because they were helping to open doors for survivors, as opposed to kind of constantly feeling like maybe they're encountering barriers and not being able to help them access safe outcomes in relation to their housing. So I'm going to quickly run you through some of the findings that we have from the first year of the pilot. And this is, in the first 6 months, we spent that getting ourselves ready, planning and preparing, coordinating the project. We delivered our activities between April and March for a 1-year period. And the direct services that we offer to survivors, I'm really proud of our project team, because all of the partners mobilized themselves really quickly to get themselves ready. And the mobile advocates and the co-located housing advocates across the sites, they delivered support to over 1,000 survivors and 1,000 dependent children. So that is just, a huge number of survivors that have benefited from this kind of support. And alongside that, we were able to, issue funds through the Flexible Fund to 141 survivors and 185 dependent children at a total of £66,000. The average amount that was requested was for about £500, and the majority was about setting up a new home. And many survivors said that without this fund, that they just wouldn't have been able to access safety. And in our London site in particular, it's quite interesting to note that of all of those survivors in London, 56% were from a Black or minoritized ethnic group, and 25% of the survivors who accessed the fund had no recourse to public funds. And these women are at some of the sharpest edges of inequality in our society. And we'd like to think that flexible funding helps to redress the imbalance of that and address some of the oppression and discrimination that these women face. In addition to this, our partners at Safer London did a fantastic job at setting up a reciprocal scheme in Cambridgeshire and worked across 3 sites to capacity build how survivors are able to keep a secure tenancy if they do have to move. And you'll hear more about that later today. And then we were also able to issue 349 sanctuary schemes, which meant that the majority of those were for survivors to be able to remain in their own homes, which is what they want to do. Survivors are telling us that we need to be doing more to enable them to stay at home, and that we need to be doing more to remove the perpetrator. So we're going to hear a bit about that later. We also did some work in terms of capacity building. So this is that second tier work that Guddy mentioned, where we worked with the professionals and the organisations and the partnerships locally to think about how we can work together to deliver a better coordinated community response in relation to housing. And so you're going to hear from Surviving Economic Abuse, and you're going to hear from Deidre Cartwright, who's our Daha development manager working in the private rented sector, who's taken over from Vicky Watts, who started off that project in 2017. But today, both Deidre and Steph are doing a fantastic job of doing some really pioneering, innovative work of really getting into these sectors and finding out what it is like for survivors living in the private rented and privately owned sectors. So I won't steal their thunder. I'll let you hear from them directly about the exciting work that they're doing. And I always learn so much when I hear from them. And just to draw attention to the work that we're doing in Daha around the social housing accreditation side of it. So we have development managers working very hard and tirelessly, supporting providers across the country. We're working with over 100 providers to date. We have in our project sites those development managers supported 9 providers to either start the process or continue to work through it. And we saw 2 providers become accredited during this phase. And this was particularly in Cambridgeshire, where we have a dedicated Daha development manager who has been funded by this project to do that. And we can see the real impact it can make having that dedicated lead there on the ground. So I want to end on sharing with you that, the whole housing approach, the components themselves are really impactful, but what we're learning and what we're seeing is that it's the combination of those components when they come together that has the greatest impact for survivors. And what we did is we took feedback from survivors across all of the work that we did, but what we wanted to do was look at that combination, like I said. So we identified 3 survivors in particular that we spoke to about what was happening before you accessed a whole housing approach and during, and then what happened at the end and what would have happened if you didn't have this support. And I want to share with you one of the stories from Isla, whose name has been changed for anonymity purposes. And if you look at this, you'll see that there's a pathway that goes into a green direction, and that's where the whole housing intervention starts and what happened for Isla. And the red path represents the outcomes that were prevented. So I'll just quickly walk you through that. Isla was living at home, in a private rented home with her abusive, violent husband who would physically assault her on a regular basis. They had 2 children together. Isla was attending A&E for her injuries. Children's services became involved. They placed the children on a child protection plan, and they put conditions on Isla saying, if you don't get to a place of safety and remove these children, they'll be taken into care. At that point, the social worker referred Isla to a mobile advocate. That mobile advocate spent time just getting to know Isla, saying, what is it that we can do? What will make the most difference for you right now? And learning upon that, it was really focused on housing. They supported Isla. Isla had enough money to be able to secure a property in the private rented sector, but she didn't have the funds to make that house into a home. So flexible funding was issued. The sanctuary scheme was offered as well to put additional security measures on the property. And whilst the works were being carried out, her mobile advocate attended the property and sat with Isla whilst that was happening to offer support. And in the end, Isla said that she was very happy to be in her accommodation, to have the support of her mobile advocate, and felt safe in her home and able to be living independently and free from her abusive husband. She also said to us at the end that, she felt that if the whole housing approach, if that support wasn't in place, that it was very likely she would have stayed with her husband. He would have continued to abuse her. She would have continued to access emergency services. She was really scared and worried her children would have been taken out of her care, and that she would have eventually had to make an emergency homeless application to the local authority. And if you see at the bottom right-hand screen that, the cost of the whole housing intervention came to just under, £1,300. And yet, if we look at what those combined costs of those outcomes that could have gone wrong for Isla came to a total cost of just under £80,000. What we're seeing is that for a very small investment, we are yielding very high savings for the public purse, and we're making Isla and other survivors' lives much more safer, we're delivering meaningful outcomes for them. And I just want to also end on saying here that, we've had a short space of time, 18 months, to mobilize and get this together, to deliver these activities, and to develop a toolkit. And it's been down to the power of working in partnership with the partners we've got through the whole housing project, but also with those partners on the ground who had a real will to make a difference in the lives of survivors. And I just want to say that, if we can do this, you can definitely do this in your local area. So please use our report from the one-year study and also the toolkit that you have to start getting conversations going in your local areas, because just that alone will definitely start to make housing options better for survivors on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, and well done for dealing with that technical hitch like an absolute pro. So Freya's now going to share a video of Leanne Taylor giving the perspective of one of our areas in terms of local authority at Stockton-On-Tees Council.
Good afternoon, I'm Leanne Taylor and I'm the Whole Housing Project Officer for Stockton-On-Tees Borough Council. I'm delighted to have been invited to talk to you about our involvement in the Whole Housing Project. As many of you may not know anything about Stockton, I thought I'd tell you a little bit about the town. Stockton is located in the northeast of England and is part of the Tees Valley sub-region. It comprises of 6 thriving towns, namely Stockton, Thornaby, Billingham, Norton, Ingerby Barwick and Yarm. Here are a few facts that I'd like to share with you about Stockton. The motivation for Stockton joining the Whole Housing Project was to develop our approach towards the housing response to domestic abuse under the umbrella of the borough-wide domestic abuse strategy. The specific appeal for Stockton joining the Whole Housing Project was to both contribute to the national domestic abuse discussion and learn, share and develop best practice models based on different challenges faced within our communities. Domestic abuse, as many of us will know, takes several different forms, which is why tackling domestic abuse is everyone's business. Local authorities have a unique position in our communities to coordinate strategic response to domestic abuse by working collaboratively with partner agencies to ensure consistency and quality of responses at a time when victims or those at risk of becoming victims require the interventions of local services. Recognising the importance of this position within our communities, Stockton utilised the whole housing framework to engage in new and different discussions with partner agencies to examine options for greater collaboration, identifying obstacles and barriers to accessing services, remove duplication, building on existing positive relationships to deliver proactive rather than reactive responses to customer needs. Crucial to the success of the whole housing approach is the identification and recognition of the presence of domestic abuse, managing the issue sensitively with empathy and knowing the local tools available to keep individuals and families safe and free of domestic abuse. Throughout the Stockton pilot, we've communicated and shared common messages and promoted an environment of supported learning and open discussions with colleagues and partner agencies, sharing specialist training offered by partners within the project, and through showcasing and hosting the screening of open class theatres, Rattlesnake performance at a local cinema for free of charge. As well as raising awareness, we explored collectively how we could respond to domestic abuse. Interestingly, following some of our sessions, some of the audience members have subsequently felt able and supported to share their own experiences of domestic abuse, or have recognised some previous experiences that they've witnessed the behaviour. And we thankfully were prepared for this eventuality with the assistance of our contracted domestic abuse services, Harbour, or the specialists that were on site to assist on that day. Central to our housing policy reviews is overlaying the whole housing approach and utilising the new knowledge and experience to embed key messages, learning and understanding so that key frontline workers are better able and prepared to identify and support victims or those vulnerable to domestic abuse in a more bespoke way. Critically, it's about positive relationships and building trust to be best equipped to intervene and support customers when they most need support and at the time which best suits their recovery. Equally though, it's about changing negative behaviour and actions likely to lead to harm or distress and understanding the triggers for perpetrator behaviour so that such circumstances can be avoided and potential perpetrators can be supported, significantly reducing the likelihood of domestic abuse reoffending. So what's next? The challenge of domestic abuse regrettably has not disappeared, and the national reports are informing us the prevalence and risk of domestic abuse has increased during the COVID-19 pandemic. The Whole Housing Project is funded until March 2021. Opportunities to extend the lifetime of the project will be pursued in tandem with the immediate aim to continue to embed the learning and the good practice into the delivery of local services, introduce early identifiers with partner agencies to remain proactive rather than reactive, and respond positively to the new Domestic Abuse Bill. As the government implements the Domestic Abuse Bill, there are clear obligations on the public services to respond, but the value and scale of the local response will be dependent upon the strength, willingness, skills of local agencies across all sectors working effectively in collaboration. This is particularly pertinent given the context of COVID-19 and the continued damaging effect of the virus on the levels of resources available, capacity and ability to mobilise quickly to meet community needs. The Domestic Abuse Bill contains and promotes many duties aimed at strengthening local responses to the needs of some of our most vulnerable members of the community. As we digest, assess and appraise the impact of the new duties, we need to refocus our commitment to delivering safe and secure environments free from fear of domestic abuse. Housing is central to the response to the Domestic Abuse Bill, and therefore the whole housing approach is more relevant today than it's ever been. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Leanne, for that. I know it's not as loud as it could have been, but hopefully you got the gist of everything that Leanne was saying in terms of the local authority perspective. We've also got Alan Glue, who's on our panel later. So in terms of what's up next, we're going to hear from the 3 specialist services that really led the way in the local areas in terms of frontline delivery. And we're going to start with Rennice from Advance, and we've got Angie from Cambridgeshire Women's Aid, and also Mandy from Refuge. So I'm going to ask you to put your screens on and your microphones on, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Rennice and I am a Community and Co-location Manager at Advance. We work towards changing and saving lives of women and girls who experience domestic abuse and women who are involved in the criminal justice system. Our contribution to the whole housing approach is co-location advocacy. Here's a visual representation of the co-location model, which is essentially having a specialist service embedded within another service. So our housing advocates provide direct support to survivors of domestic abuse, one-to-one support to professionals, and we aim for a whole system change, which includes improving the response to domestic abuse and helping to bridge the gap between survivors and services. Here are some of the barriers that women may face when trying to secure safe accommodation. So one of the barriers that we have here is housing professionals are not always DV or trauma informed. So many victim survivors, when they approach the local authority for housing assistance, they're sometimes met by housing professionals who ask questions such as, why are you only just leaving now? Do you have evidence? Do you have a crime reference? Do you have a crime report? And sometimes that can be very difficult for her to provide that information. Language barriers is also an issue for many victim survivors. Is she provided with an independent interpreter? does she have a safe space to speak, or is the alleged perpetrator providing that interpretation? So the support we provide to victim survivors is immediate risk of harm through completing the Safe Lives Risk Assessment and referring high-risk survivors to the Multi-Agency Risk Assessment Conference. We help survivors understand the options available to them, for example, civil remedies. We provide support through the criminal justice system, and we make referrals to specialist services, such as mental health. We provide alternative housing options like sanctuary scheme referrals, and support survivors who have no recourse to public funds. Our approach is trauma-informed, holistic, and survivor-led. The support we provide to housing professionals is advice on best practice and how to identify and respond to survivors. We do this through one-to-one consultations on individual cases of survivors. We provide extensive safety planning advice. An important part of our role is bite-sized training to upskill housing professionals in relation to domestic abuse awareness. Here are some of the feedback that we've received. Having a housing advocate present is a helpful resource as the client is able to receive specialist support whilst allowing the housing officers to focus on the client's housing needs. And feedback from a survivor. I was scared to approach the council because I thought I would not be believed. It was helpful that you were able to speak directly with my housing officer to explain the risk posed to me from my ex-partner. Here are some of our outcomes. 97% of our survivors felt supported after receiving support from ourselves. Thank you for listening, and please refer to our toolkit for more information on how you could embed the co-location model within your service.
Thank you, Rennice. I'm Angie Stewart. I'm Chief Executive Officer of Cambridge Women's Aid. So we've been providing specialist domestic abuse support services in Cambridge for over 40 years. And as part of the whole housing approach, alongside the national charity Refuge, we have provided a mobile advocacy project in Cambridgeshire. So mobile advocacy is a key part of the whole housing approach. It provides a community-based, direct, open access service to people who are experiencing domestic abuse. Now this service is needs-led, it is not process-driven, and it focuses on what that victim survivor needs in terms of support, advocacy and resources. The service is provided by our skilled and experienced workers who will hold significant knowledge about the options that are available to those experiencing domestic abuse. And this is so that we can bring about resources such as actual things like income, donations, housing, but also bring the resource of knowledge about survivors' rights, what help is available and what support they can access locally. So having all the parts of the whole housing approach that you're going to hear about today, having that available to us locally, it's a significant resource and it greatly improves the offer to those affected by domestic abuse. Now our service is very flexible, it's very much led by the person using the service. We are open access regardless of risk, and anyone can access our support regardless of their background. It's open to all, including, for example, those with no recourse to public funds. And it is very much focused on working in a trauma-informed way while helping to address the client's self-identified needs. And we will support with a huge range of those issues, such as, for example, one of the main things that survivors will want and need will be support needed around helping them to gain or remain in safe accommodation, and that will include all tenures. And this is a significant part of our work, which we mentioned a lot today by our co-speakers. But in addition, we are also going to support with a wide range of other support. So that might be help accessing benefits, education, employment, engagement with other agencies, and really we will help with access to any support or service that will help improve a victim survivor's current situation. And that might be support provided by us, or it might be provided by others. So please make some time to look at the section in the toolkit. There is some really useful information about the way that we work, and it also has some excellent case studies there to inform you. Now, we know that this way of working is right for those that we support because we talk to them. We've held service user forums and they're very clear about that, because here relationships matter. That is the relationship that our mobile advocacy workers have with those that we support, but also the collaborative relationships that we have with the other agencies who can provide the other aspects of the whole housing approach. So it means that where we can't help directly, often we will know who can. And we particularly appreciate the number of open doors that we now have with our partners within the whole housing approach. We are undoubtedly all stronger together. Now, by being needs-led, we can flex to what is needed. So in Cambridgeshire, we have some very different populations with different needs. So for example, we have both cities and very rural areas. And what our mobile advocacy service does is, as far as possible, is give our experienced and our skilled workers the ability and the permission to work in the way that is right for them to meet the needs of that person in need of the support. The flexibility will include how engagement happens, such as phone, text, in their home, in our office, and that person can experience support as and when it is needed. And we know that the victims and survivors will have many and varied challenges and barriers in accessing support. So our approach seeks to reduce those barriers as much as possible, both barriers to engaging with our service, but also how can we reduce the barriers that survivors have accessing support from other businesses and agencies, which will be set out very well by my co-presenters today. Now, we love working in this way. It really matters to us. We recognise the reductionary nature of domestic abuse, just how much perpetrators take away from survivors, particularly the women and children who tend to experience the very worst of it. Now, by working in this way, we are bringing resources into the lives of those who are using our services, and we're helping them to create a space for action. Any of you involved in this work, you will know just how important it is that we do that. The whole housing approach significantly supports this way of working. Undoubtedly, this increases the resources that we can access to help create that space for action. So not only are our mobile advocacy workers holders of the knowledge that will support someone to find solutions and for their situation to become safer, the whole housing approach also means that we are holders of that resource that Rebecca spoke about earlier called flexible funding, and that can be used as needed in a timely and a targeted way. I will now hand over to Mandy from Refuge to speak more about this important aspect of our work. Thank you.
Thank you, Angie. My name is Mandy Geraghty and I am the Service Manager for Refuge in Cambridgeshire. I'm going to talk to you today in a little bit more detail about flexible funding, how it works and the administration of the scheme. So flexible funding only works when it gives victims access to immediate funds. It might enable an emergency move, access to accommodation, or allow our survivors to remain in their own homes. Examples include buying white goods for a new property, children's furniture, or maybe just a man with a van to help a client move. We've also done things like install ring doorbells, which means that a victim are allowed to remain safely in their own home. The administration of the fund is really, really important, and the speed at which the client can receive the funding is vital in keeping families safe. So how does it work? Well, in Cambridgeshire and with Refuge, the mobile advocate identifies a client's need, makes an application detailing why a client needs the money and the amount. Once this is authorised, the amount is put directly into the client's bank account within 48 hours. The speed of this transaction is essential because often lives are at risk. Because our clients are often at crisis point, we do not ask for any evidence of how that funding has been spent. It's really important to record who is accessing the fund. It gives you an idea to identify the gaps in local provision and also highlight needs of specific groups. So I'm going to share my screen now and I'm going to leave you with some quotes from our clients to give you an idea of how vital flexible funding is in keeping victims and their families safe in their own homes. Thank you. I'm now going to hand back to Guddy.
Thanks, Mandy, Rennice, and that was unbelievable. Sorry, I'm just trying to get my head around what we're doing next. Sorry about that. And Angie. So essentially, we've heard from the specialist services. We are running a little bit behind, so we're going to move swiftly on to hearing about Housing First, which is one of the other components of the whole housing. And we've got Natalie from Standing Together and Rhiannon from Solace who are presenting on this. If you could unmute yourselves. Great.
Hi, thanks, Guddy. Let me just share my screen first. There we go. Okay, so hi everyone. My name is Natalie Wong and I'm the Housing First and Homelessness Coordinator at Standing Together. And joining me today, we have Rhiannon Barrow from Solace Women's Aid.
Hello, I'm Rhiannon. I'm from Solace. I'm a Senior Housing First project worker in Westminster.
And for the next few minutes, we'll be talking about Housing First for Women who have experienced violence against women and girls, or VAUG, and why it's an important component of the whole housing approach. So to start with, what is Housing First? Housing First is a housing and support model that was developed for people who have been chronically homeless, have multiple disadvantages, such as severe mental health issues and substance misuse issues, and who have been unable to engage with mainstream services due to their high support needs. The way that it works is demonstrated in this diagram here on the left. So you can see that traditional homelessness support usually requires someone to go through these steps before they're offered a property. With Housing First, housing is offered first with no conditions attached other than their willingness to sustain a tenancy. Intensive support is offered alongside the housing and is crucial in supporting people with maintaining these tenancies. It's underpinned by a set of 7 principles, which Rhiannon will be speaking a bit more about later on, and how they relate to survivors. And just a quick note about how successful the model is, as one of the first questions people want to know is whether it works or not. And in short, yeah, it does. So both international and national evidence has consistently shown that between 70 to 90% of Housing First residents have maintained their tenancy and made progress in other areas of their life. And there are some references in the toolkit if you're interested in reading a bit more about this. And so why Housing First for Women specifically? So research has shown that most women who are homeless and have multiple disadvantage have likely experienced abuse from childhood and have experienced domestic abuse in adulthood, as well as a continuum of other gendered violence and abuse. Women are also more likely to be among the hidden homeless population, and therefore a general Housing First service aimed at rough sleepers would likely be majority men. And this model and its principles align with gender and trauma-informed practice, and therefore lend well to being specifically adapted to support women experiencing homelessness. I will now hand over to Rhiannon to explain this a bit further.
We have incorporated the Housing First principles into gender trauma-informed practice for Housing First for Women. Firstly, housing is a fundamental human right and prioritised safety, as there are more risks for homeless women than men. It is not to be seen as something to be earned or as a reward. Building trusting, safe and long-term relationships are key for trauma-informed practice. Support is not fixed for a set period of time and is flexible to meet the client's needs. The offer of housing is unconditional, regardless of which services she chooses to engage with. Once again, this prioritises safety and stability, which is a core need for healing from trauma. For VAUG survivors who had their autonomy stripped away by a perpetrator, Housing First allows them to regain their agency and independence. This group of women have fallen through the cracks for years and mistrust services. An active engagement approach puts responsibility on the service to engage with them and shows that the women that they won't be given up on. And we take into consideration every woman's hopes and dreams for their future, and we are led by them. Our aim is to support them throughout their journey to empowerment and self-determination. Our workers understand the risks of VAUG and the gendered experience of women with multiple disadvantage, and we actively work to manage the risk, reduce the harm, including harm from others, harm to others, and harm to themselves.
Thanks, Rhiannon. Now that we've heard a bit about Housing First more generally, we'll explain a bit more about our project, which is called the Westminster Vogue Housing First Project. It's a partnership project and specifically supports women who have experienced VOG, have experienced entrenched homelessness, and have multiple disadvantage. So starting in the blue box, the project is funded by the MHCLG and commissioned by Westminster City Council. In the green box, Standing Together initially developed the project and now provides coordination of the partnership and evaluation. This critical role provides oversight and drives the project's direction. Moving over to the yellow box, housing is provided by a coalition of registered social landlords. So they are Peabody, Southern, L&Q, Women's Pioneer and Octavia Housing. And we're extremely grateful to the housing providers for their involvement, because without them, the project wouldn't be the success that it is. And now back over to Rhiannon to explain in more detail about Solace's involvement in the first year of the project.
The support side of the project is provided by Solace Women's Aid. In the pilot year, it was provided by 2 staff. Now we expanded to 4 staff, and we're expanding the project further with recruitment. The pilot project was commissioned to support 10 women. However, we supported 11 women as 1 was owed to statutory duty and was able to move via the Pan London Housing Reciprocal. As a specialist charity, all project workers are trained in VOG. We offer IDFA support and more, providing holistic support with all areas of women's life. We offer practical and emotional support, and we work in partnership with different agencies and act as a single point of contact, reducing the risk of the service user being overwhelmed. Paperwork such as risk assessments, safety and support plans have been adapted to be more trauma-informed and tailored for work with women experiencing multiple disadvantage. The pilot project has led to many successful outcomes. Here are a few on the screen which you can see. A couple to note are that 8 out of 9 women who were offered tenancies have been able to maintain them. All of these women had previously been rough sleeping for many years and had previously struggled in supported accommodation. Another great achievement is that 2 of our women who were formerly rough sleeping have now been accepted into college and are settling into their flats very well.
Thanks, Rhiannon. Those are some great outcomes in the first year. And so just to finish, here are some key considerations when setting up a Housing First service for women. So in the first box, engagement needs to be considered. A Housing First service needs to account for the extra time and capacity workers will need to build trusting relationships with women with complex trauma. Onto the second box, a service for women will need to manage risks relating to domestic abuse and gender-based violence, and it's best if a specialist service offers the Housing First support. The toolkit has more detail about what needs to be considered when finding the right specialist support provider. A third consideration is supporting women as mothers, whether or not they have any contact with their children. This support need is often overlooked by services, but actually this can make a really big difference in supporting their recovery. And then on a practical note, funding that is sustainable and long-term needs to be thought about to increase the women's chances of safety and recovery. I would encourage commissioners to consider longer commissioning cycles. One thing I'll mention here is that Housing First doesn't have a reputation for being cheap. However, the cost of Housing First offsets other public costs, such as frequent A&E visits and the costs associated with these women being stuck in homelessness pathways for years with not many gains. So this is a smart financial reinvestment. And finally, in the last box, what makes Housing First so effective? The housing. For survivors of abuse to begin recovering from their trauma, they firstly need affordable, secure and suitable housing as a stable foundation before they can address their other needs. So things to consider are the type of tenancies offered and how long the tenancy lasts for. Ideally, the longer the tenancy, the better. This model is imperative for the whole housing approach because, as you've seen, the model targets those who are the most vulnerable, disadvantaged, and most likely to fall through the cracks. By considering Housing First in the whole housing approach, you can safely say that you're offering housing options and justice for all survivors of abuse. I would encourage you all to think about how you could implement Housing First for women locally in your area. And if you would like any help with this, please do get in touch. Alternatively, if you're a housing provider who's interested in joining our Westminster VOG Housing First partnership, please also feel free to get in touch. As Rhiannon said, we're expanding and we're in need of more units and would love to work with you. Our contact details are on the screen. Thank you, and back to you, Guddy.
Thank you so much. I love that plug for units at the end for housing providers. It is such an amazing initiative and we really want to work with more and more. I'm going to very quickly hand over to hear about managed reciprocals, the DAHA and some stuff around perpetrator management with Clementine from Safer London and then Danai from Cambridgeshire City Council. Thanks.
Thanks, Guddy. I'm gonna just share my screen and make sure you can all see it. So I'm Clementine from Safer London. I'm part of the team that started the Pan-London Housing Reciprocal, and I'll try to explain very quickly what a managed reciprocal scheme is. Just to set the context, it's a housing intervention focusing on the social housing sector, and you'll hear more in detail later about survivors who need solutions in the private sector, but the managed reciprocal is for the social housing sector. What is it in a nutshell? It's a partnership between social housing providers that includes both social councils, so local authorities, and housing associations. And essentially, they agree to work together to rehouse their tenants who are fleeing domestic abuse so that they can keep a social tenancy. Why do we need this kind of model? We found out that in areas where there's a shortage of social housing, survivors are more likely to lose their secure tenancy when they are trying to flee abuse. Research found that over half of women who had a secure tenancy in London lost their secure tenancy when they fled the abusive relationship. And that's just unfair. It's a form of re-victimization of survivors of domestic abuse. And instead of supporting them, we're taking away the secure tenancy. As a result, the fear of losing the secure tenancy is a huge barrier to leaving the perpetrator, which means that a lot of victims and survivors have to cope with the abuse and the risk for years because they know that if they leave, they will end up homeless, being hosted in temporary accommodation, having to go into the private rented sector that is not affordable. And as a result, a lot of them stay at risk. So a managed reciprocal scheme is really to prevent that from happening, enabling survivors to have access to affordable and long-term housing that is in a safe place. How does it work? You can find a lot more details in the toolkit, but very basically, it's an agreement that the landlords signed where they commit to reciprocate the same size property for each of the tenants that is rehoused. Each of the landlords have named leads that are responsible for the reciprocal activity. And there is a central coordinator that is an independent agency that centrally coordinates referrals and keep tracks of moves. So in London, the central coordinators are Safer London. That's the team that I'm based with. And basically, we ensure that all the social landlords that are part of the reciprocal scheme in London give back properties when their tenants are rehoused. We ensure that the scheme is fair and transparent for all the landlords that are taking part. And we also ensure that all the tenants who need to move because of abuse are supported by specialist advocates. So it's really a multi-agency response. On one side, you have the housing professionals who allocate the properties, sign the tenancies. On the other side, we make sure that there are domestic abuse advocates and support workers who work with the tenants and make sure that the relocation process is safe. They can access flexible funding for specific items if they need to. They are linked in with services in a new area. So it's really a multi-agency response, and there is a funded coordinating team in the middle who make sure that everyone does what they need to do. It's a cost-effective intervention because it means that victims don't have to go into temporary accommodation for years, and it works best when it's integrated. And when I'm saying integrated, I'm thinking in particular for the social landlords. So as a landlord, you need to integrate managed reciprocal within your policies, within your allocation policies, within your internal management transfer policies. And if you are going for DAHA accreditation, you need to integrate that within the overall response to domestic abuse that you will give to your tenants. The schemes that exist, as I mentioned, is the Pan-London Housing Reciprocal. That's the first large-scale scheme that started about 3 years ago. And if we've learned anything about those 3 years of experience coordinating reciprocal moves, is that there is a huge demand for cross-borough moves. We had over 700 referrals in 3 years, and we've had over 300 people moving in the first 3 years. And last year, we supported Cambridgeshire to set up their own reciprocal scheme locally. We had already 4 moves in the first year, which is brilliant. And one innovation that I'm going to mention in Cambridgeshire is that the landlords agreed to open referrals for perpetrators when it's deemed safe to do so and when the victim wants to remain in the family home. And that has a lot of potential, because often in areas where there isn't enough social housing for everyone, it's even harder to find a family home. So if we can make a referral for someone who only needs a 1-bed property or a studio, it makes things a lot easier. The victim can stay in the family home, and the landlord is not making the perpetrator homeless by giving the tenancy to the survivors only. So just to finish, I'll point you to the toolkit. If there's anyone working in social housing listening and you think in your area, you know that tenants are struggling to keep their social tenancy if they are fleeing domestic abuse, I encourage you to look at the toolkit to get ideas of how to set up a reciprocal scheme. There's a lot of background research that we've done before setting up the scheme in London. There's a lot of tips and practical tools to help you implement a reciprocal scheme. There's a process flow chart, templates for the reciprocal agreement, templates for a referral form. There's an example of the monitoring database that we use in London. So you don't have to reinvent all of those tools, you can use them. And you can also contact us if you're thinking of starting a reciprocal scheme. We've been approached by individuals in Greater Manchester, Kent and Leicester. So by all means, come to us and we're happy to have a chat. And I'll just finish with one quote from a tenant who has successfully moved via a reciprocal agreement. She just fed back that she feels safer, she can walk out, she's not getting death threats anymore, she feels more relaxed. And that really highlights that giving access to a safe home where the perpetrator doesn't know the address, that is affordable and long-term, really means a fresh start for someone who's experienced domestic abuse. And it really is the only way for someone to kind of recover from the trauma that they've experienced. So I'll now hand over to Danae, who will talk a little bit more about other interventions that social landlords can do to respond to domestic abuse.
Thank you, Clementine. So I'm Danae Evans and I'm a housing officer for Cambridge City Council, City Homes. We manage the City Council's housing stock and are the largest provider of social housing in Cambridge. I'm also the domestic abuse lead for City Homes and work with many others across the City Council to achieve our DAHA accreditation in December 2019. That was with the support of Standing Together, Sharon, Caroline, Guddy, as well as Cambridge Women's Aid, Vicky from the County Council, and many others throughout that journey. Achieving DAHA accreditation involves substantial amounts of thought, work, challenge, and communication throughout many teams and key services within the City Council. Reviewing existing and creating new policies and procedures in regards to our response to domestic abuse for residents, tenants and staff of Cambridge City Council. Also reviewing training needs and introducing mandatory domestic abuse training throughout the City Council. DAHA accreditation, however, was just the beginning for ourselves as a council. Accreditation is not an end, but a continuing commitment to challenge and respond to domestic abuse in our community. As part of our continuing work and taking into account the whole housing toolkit, we have recently completed our new target hardening policy and procedure to enable and offer choice to survivors to remain safely in their homes if they wish. This work involves several departments, the Bobby scheme and Safer Communities. We are now about to sign off on our policies and procedures around perpetrator management. I am part of the working group looking at our response to perpetrators of domestic abuse cross tenure, which involves services across the City Council, our housing advice service, supported housing, our customer service centre, community safety team, environmental services and city homes. Our objectives, which are in response to national guidance, county-wide initiatives, and taking into account again that whole housing toolkit, are to work internally to develop a perpetrator management strategy for Cambridge City Council. This will include the identification of enforcement tools against perpetrators, such as breach of tenancy agreements or barring from our housing register, effectively communicating these enforcement tools to perpetrators and tenants. Ensuring Cambridge residents, regardless of tenure, are aware of the legal avenues and support that is available to them if they wish to exclude a perpetrator from their home. The option to introduce perpetrator monitoring and the housing of perpetrators where this approach will be beneficial to the survivor, including the possible use of reciprocal managed moves outside of Cambridge City. The identification of perpetrator rehabilitation services so that staff can refer perpetrators into these services if appropriate. The provision of perpetrator management training for all staff who are actively required to work with perpetrators, and the identification of external agencies in Cambridgeshire that are also working on perpetrator management to ensure that a dialogue is established and duplication avoided. I personally attend the local perpetrator panel, which is a police-led multi-agency panel. The panel shares and gains information in regards to high-risk perpetrators in Cambridgeshire. I share relevant information with our housing advice service and home link services, as well as ensuring other housing officers are aware of perpetrators who are living in our tenancies or a risk to our tenants, and those details are recorded. There already have been positive results from attending this panel and joint working. Recently, City Homes, Housing Advice, Probation, our IDVA service and Cambridge Women's Aid worked together around a perpetrator. Worked with a perpetrator who had been released from prison and was seeking accommodation in Cambridge. We identified the survivors who were at risk, there were several, and liaised with the police, probation and their support workers, as well as speaking to the survivors themselves. The Housing Advice Service sought to find temporary accommodation outside of the city for the perpetrator and ensured all services involved with the survivors affected were aware of his location, as were police and probation. We also assisted one of the survivors to move outside of Cambridge as they wished. The perpetrator was actually returned to prison following breaches of their restraining order. I believe that effective work around perpetrators who we have in the past often ignored or not considered except as the sometimes anonymous risk is essential in any council's response to domestic abuse. The decision whether to house, exclude or evict perpetrators is not always an easy one, and the support routes for perpetrators are currently limited. However, having perpetrator management as part of our whole housing approach is an essential part of our council's ongoing response to domestic abuse and vital in supporting survivors. Thank you, and I'll pass back now to Guddy.
Thanks, Dana. That was so great to hear from a local authority perspective. And thanks, Clementine. I've heard you speak numerous times and you're always fab in terms of the award-winning, should I say, Managed Reciprocal Partnership. So we've got, before we go over to the Domestic Abuse Commissioner to get her reflections, Nicole Jacobs, we're going to go actually to Steph from Surviving Economic Abuse and Deidre from Standing Together on the private rented sector to do a bit of a double act in terms of PRS and privately owned. It's lovely to see you both.
Thanks, Guddy. Yeah, I'm Stephanie Orr. I'm a privately owned housing policy officer, at Surviving Economic Abuse, and we've been focusing on the needs of homeowners during the pilot project.
And I'm Deidre Cartwright. I'm the private rental sector development manager at Standing Together and Daha, and my work focuses on developing policy and practice that supports survivors living in privately rented accommodation.
Now we're going to talk about why it's vital that the local domestic abuse response is widened to include private housing so that it meets the needs of all the local community and avoids needless homelessness. And we're also going to tell you about how the toolkit can help you to do this and the difference this will make to victims of abuse in your area. Now, at the start of the event, we heard from a few survivors, one of whom lived in privately owned housing and one lived in private rented accommodation. And they described the immense difficulties that they faced when trying to address their housing needs and find safety. And now for the first time, the Whole Housing Approach pilot project has allowed us to take a close look at the issues faced for those who are living in private housing. And we found that actually the issues across those two tenures are quite similar. Now, one of the most alarming things that we found was that survivors are routinely being advised to either end their tenancy or allow their home to be repossessed as the easiest way to de-link economically from the perpetrator and be safe. Now, not only does this show the extent of the barriers they face and the lack of options available, but it also means that a huge amount of survivors are finding themselves homeless because they are simply unable to maintain their current home. And now this is even more significant when we think about the fact that 83% of the population live in private housing. And according to the Crime Survey of England and Wales in 2018, 77% of all survivors were living in private housing, and that was over 1.8 million people, not even taking into account their children. So of course, this is extremely important when we're thinking about homelessness prevention and the people who are having to flee to refuges or present at local authorities who maybe don't want to, but don't have another choice. And now we know that private housing is less well understood than social housing and refuges, and there's a really good reason for this. Refuges and social housing landlords sit within the coordinated community response to domestic abuse, but private housing professionals don't. Now, this is a problem because survivors in private housing are reaching out to these private professionals when they are trying to address their housing needs, and this creates a disparity in the response that they receive when they are seeking support. And now, we believe that these private housing professionals do have a key role to play in the response to domestic abuse, but they'll just need some support to do this. And their involvement in the coordinated community response would mean earlier intervention, and also that they're playing their role in helping survivors to address their housing needs. And they're a vital aspect of a whole housing approach that is holistic and meets the needs of all survivors.
So with the knowledge that there are a vast number of survivors who are living in private housing and whose needs and circumstances haven't been considered or addressed at a local or national level, our first step as a project was to be able to gain a better understanding of their experiences so that we could build policy and practice that was responsive to their specific needs. And what I'm going to do is share with you what we've learned about the experiences of survivors living in private housing to help you understand how and why, as local authorities, you can develop housing and domestic abuse strategies that are responsive to their unique circumstances. So in 2019, Daha and Surviving Economic Abuse commissioned the University of Bristol to conduct an analysis of interviews that they had done with survivors regarding their experiences of injustice while living in privately rented or privately owned homes. And what the research found was that these survivors face unique and significant barriers to becoming safe and maintaining stable housing, and that this was directly linked to their legal and economic ties to the perpetrator, through their jointly rented and their jointly owned homes, which we already know that perpetrators use as a form of economic abuse, as a form of coercive control, and ultimately as a means to drastically limiting a survivor's chances of leaving that relationship without also becoming homeless and facing economic hardship. So, for example, what the research showed is that perpetrators often accrue rent and mortgage arrears and damages in jointly owned homes and rented properties, which we know directly links to evictions, home repossessions, long-term debt, economic hardship, and of course, immediate and long-term homelessness. We also found that sharing a property with the perpetrator also prevented survivors from being able to stay safe within their home, because it meant they weren't able to get their locks changed or increase security measures and take advantage of schemes like the sanctuary scheme. But this was also dependent on individual letting agents and landlords who often had little understanding or awareness of domestic abuse to give their consent for them to increase these security measures. And it was dependent on letting agents and landlords who don't understand or feel they have a role to play in the coordinated community response to domestic abuse. And while survivors do have the option of accessing legal measures such as occupation orders, domestic violence protection orders, and soon domestic abuse protection orders to have perpetrators temporarily removed from the property, there are no guarantees that these orders are granted. And even if they are only temporary and do not address the long-term tenancy and economic issues that ultimately do make survivors and their children homeless and at risk of harm. Due to these legal barriers regarding joint tenancy and joint mortgages, currently the only options available to survivors to have perpetrators permanently removed from either shared tenancies or shared mortgages is for them to have to take on the responsibility of ending these agreements, to become homeless, and to attempt to regain their tenancies or their mortgages on their own, or go through a very lengthy and complicated legal process, which does actually address the immediate safety and housing needs of survivors and their children. And even after these long-winded and difficult legal processes, this doesn't account for the economic abuse and financial hardships that survivors will face in not being able to afford private rent or mortgages, or dealing with banks and landlords who may be unwilling to take the risk of investing in them as tenants or as homeowners. And because of all of these barriers, many survivors felt their only option was to end their tenancies, to leave their jointly owned homes, to become homeless, and to deal with the financial penalties of starting again. And this is not to forget all of the barriers that all survivors face when attempting to leave an abusive relationship. The whole housing approach, as Stephanie has said, is the first of its kind to do the groundbreaking work of first analysing and evidencing the experiences of survivors living in the private rental sector so that we can respond to their unique needs. And we encourage local authority professionals to use this evidence, which is provided in the toolkit, to consider the needs and circumstances of survivors within your own local area who are undoubtedly living in private housing, but are not accessing support or the options they require in order to stay in their home or relocate without lasting economic harm. Standing Together, DAHA, and Surviving Economic Abuse have been using this evidence to find new and innovative ways of addressing the needs of survivors in private housing at a local level by working with local authority pilot areas who have played a very vital role in bringing private housing professionals such as landlords, letting agents, and estate agents into the coordinated community response. So in the first year of piloting the work, we found that private landlords, when they are provided with support and guidance from specialist domestic abuse services, but also from local authority housing teams, they played a key role in first identifying individuals who are experiencing domestic abuse. They were able to signpost them into specialist services, but these private housing professionals were also able to provide them with support in a way that meant they could stay in their home, whether that was approving lock changes or helping them address rent arrears, helping them transfer tenancies into their own name after the perpetrator had left the property. When they're involved, they can play a vital role. And we've been working with stakeholders at a national level, such as the Association of Residential letting agents, the National Residential Landlords Association, and other stakeholders to build the economic and moral case for professionals' involvement within the coordinated community response, and then working at a local level to do so as well. And the toolkit provides you much guidance on how you can do that as well. But as Steph will now detail, our innovative work is about addressing these issues both at a policy and a practice level. And we need to influence legislation that can support these survivors to access real housing options.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to talk about the policy work that we've done and the importance of it for those in private housing. Now, I could spend a really long time detailing the issues that survivors face that need to be addressed in policy, but we really just don't have time to do justice to that, and I know we're running a little bit behind. But what I can say is that we're going to hear from some survivors shortly to give a snapshot about what it's been like for them living in private housing. And to summarise, most of the issues we find are economic, and really they're not within the power of frontline professionals to be able to deal with, which is why we need this national policy focus. And we know that access to economic resources, or a lack thereof post-separation, is a primary reason that survivors return to an abuser after separating, and also that economic abuse either starts or can be exacerbated after separation, because it's one of the few forms of abuse that can be carried out at an arm's length without close physical proximity. So it's really important that we're able to address this. And there are options like flexible funding that can be done at the local level to do this, but we know that locally, all of these needs can't be met. Now, there is a dedicated chapter on economic abuse in the toolkit for those who want to hear more about this, and it's applicable across all of the housing tenures. But fundamentally, in private housing, the crux of many of the issues seems to arise because of the joint and several liability of mortgage contracts and tenancies. And these really require the agreement of both parties to make any changes. So you can imagine how much control this gives to perpetrators. And this is part of the reason why so many survivors are advised to simply just give up their tenancy or allow their home to be repossessed and deal with the devastating economic fallout afterwards as the preferred option, And this, of course, needlessly adds to the burdens on local authorities and refuges when many of these survivors want to stay in their homes. So for the first time, we're taking these issues to legislators and addressing them within a policy focus to try and strengthen pathways and options that will support the local approach. So one policy area that we're looking at keenly with Women's Aid and other partners is about joint tenancies. And some of you may know that there's been a lot of policy activity in Scotland recently about this. So the Justice Secretary in Scotland announced only a couple of weeks ago that they're proposing legislation to make it easier for social landlords to transfer a tenancy from the perpetrator to a survivor. And I'm sure many listening in to this event would, can imagine how beneficial that would be, And we're trying to build on these provisions and also apply them to the private housing sector too, so that it includes private renters. And now for homeowners, as I said, there are so many areas of policy focus that we just can't go into now. However, C are holding a webinar on the 2nd of December for anyone who wants to hear more about this and the policy work that we're doing to address this. But really, we found that it's a vital combination of both this policy and practice that's really key to transforming the response to those in private housing.
So while we're doing work at a national level to increase the options of survivors in private housing to stay in their homes or relocate without lasting harm, we encourage you as local service providers and local commissioners to reflect on whether you are considering and addressing the needs of survivors in private housing when developing your own responses to domestic abuse. The toolkit and our chapters within it provide detailed case studies and evidence regarding the experiences of survivors in private housing, which you can use to better understand their needs and circumstances. However, it's important for you to be able to assess the needs of survivors within your local area so that you can build a response that meets their specific needs. The toolkit also makes specific recommendations for local areas to bring private rental sector and private ownership professionals into your coordinated community response as a means of supporting survivors to be able to stay in their home or relocate. So for example, local authority housing teams such as environmental health or private rental sector teams are in the prime position of having relationships with private rental sector landlords through selective licensing schemes, training, accreditation, to link in with those private sector landlords, to link them to those domestic abuse services, to provide them with guidance and support about their role in supporting survivors. And the toolkit also provides the guidance and resources that you can provide directly to the private rental sector and private ownership professionals in your local area. And we really encourage you to use these toolkits to do so, but to also get in contact with Stephanie and I if you want to discuss how to do this better in your local area.
Yeah, absolutely. And for us, these housing options and tenures, they can't be siloed. It's really about a whole picture. You know, homeowners may find themselves in refuges, private renters may present at local authority, and both of them may need a mobile advocate, a housing IDVA, flexible funding, all different sorts of options. And so it's really important that all of these are covered holistically and thought about as a whole. And when we're talking about private housing, it's really important to go back to that point and remember that this is 83% of the population. This is a huge amount of people whose needs need to be met. And from April, the new statutory duty coming in will require a needs assessment of the housing support needs of all survivors in the local area. And we really hope that the toolkit can shine a light on the needs of those in private housing and really help to support this assessment process, because this really has the potential to make a huge impact on reducing homelessness. And now finally, we'll hear from some of the survivors from the Experts by Experience group who work with C and who have supported us at every stage of this work. Now their insight will show the devastating impact of abuse in private housing and just why local responses to domestic abuse must include these tenures. And Deirdre and I will leave you with their words.
Can't hear.
Really hopeless situation. It felt like I couldn't solve it. Nothing I could do would sort it out. I was totally powerless. The stress of managing that on a day-to-day basis was just awful. I didn't sleep. If I did, I'd wake up in the night panicking about it.
When your home is threatened, you are threatened. And it's really scary.
To sell a house takes time. You can't just up and go. There's preparing for sale, dealing with estate agents, and you don't know who to trust.
I'm now about to do my third move since I got divorced. It's affected my mental health tremendously. For the last 20 years, I've been in and out of depression and on antidepressants. It's affected my sleep.
Weirdly, if I didn't have a home and I was renting somewhere, I might have actually possibly got more support. It's like you're on a separate list of you are void from any kind of support because you have a home. It completely goes against you. It's like being blacklisted.
There isn't a blueprint either for what I went through. There is no, you can't see yourself in all the stories around abuse. So you stay because you can't see yourself in those stories. You think, well, I am a homeowner, I've got my name on this mortgage, I should be safe, and you're not safe.
Sorry about the sound difficulties at the beginning, but from reading it, I'm sure you got the gist, and it's always so powerful to bring it back to those women with lived experiences of what they've been through. Thanks so much, Deirdre and Steph, for that really comprehensive overview in terms of policy and practice. And you know, it astounds me to this day that there's only a handful, not even a handful of people working in the private rented sector and privately owned sector, and we need to see more of that. I'm really pleased to say we've got a panel after this, and we're running almost on time, so that's good, because I want to make sure that the panel members get as much time to talk as possible and we can have a conversation. We've got Nicole Jacobs with us, the Designate Domestic Abuse Commissioner for England and Wales. Are you there? There you are. It's lovely to see you. Is your sound on?
Yep.
And we just wanted to hear, obviously, your reflections, because also you've been with the project from its inception, or have known about it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Guddy. For those of you who've not met me before, I'm really thrilled to be able to talk to you, all 300 some of you. And I'm so thrilled that you are here today and you have this kind of interest in hearing about the whole housing approach. And all of this incredible work. So I just have to give a huge thank you to Guddy, but literally every single member of the team who you've heard from today, and all of the sites and all of the partners. Having seen up close some of this work, so before I was appointed as the Domestic Abuse Commissioner for England and Wales, I worked at Standing Together, and I had the unique opportunity to see this partnership forming in its earliest stages. And having worked in many, many partnerships over many years, I just can't tell you from knowing it a bit up close, how effective this partnership is. And it's partly because it's rooted in such a common sense approach to what people need. You know, we can hear time and time again in every single one of these presentations that these ideas are all rooted in the lived experience of people who are subject to domestic abuse, and who for years and years and years have not had their needs met in this kind of range of ways. And so we, I think this partnership is such a beautifully formed partnership in the way that it's been constructed directly from that need, but also any partnership is only as good as the partners and the willingness to work together. And these things are extremely hard work. And I just can't tell you how proud I am to see you all do this and present your incredible work and such hard work over the last few years. And the gift of this toolkit to us all is really, really important. And I'll come back to that. For those of you who don't know me, I've just been appointed in the last year as a designate role, because my office will have a statutory underpinning in the Domestic Abuse Bill, which we're waiting for a date for it to resume in the House of Lords and be passed probably into the next calendar year. But in any case, you've heard a lot about the bill today, and some of what the bill does is establish my office. It gives my office powers to cooperate in terms of seeking information from public bodies, and an ability to make recommendations that have to be responded to within a certain number of days. And it really sets out my role, in essence, to map our services for domestic abuse in England and Wales, and particularly the non-devolved issues, so more justice-related issues in Wales. But for the whole of England, all of our services, and what I really include in that, although at the heart of our services, I'm always thinking about the specialist domestic abuse services for adults, children, perpetrators to change, that sitting around that is, of course, the coordinated community response. And that is hugely focused on many things, but housing is so critical. And so I will, you know, in terms of how what you're talking about today connects to my ambition, I see it as very, very aligned and tied, because as I and my office starts to look, and as we're set out to look and map services, really look on in a local context, what does good look like, and have a real oversight in that. I will be especially looking for these kinds of practices in relation to housing. So I hope that kind of briefly describes how I see this all fitting together so well with what my aims and ambitions as the Domestic Abuse Commissioner are and will be. But I just want to say, having worked for many, many years at a local level, some of you might be sitting thinking, this is all great. This partnership was funded to do all this incredible work. What do I do in my local area. And I guess I would say two things. Number one, you're likely spotting things and you're likely doing things that we ought to know about as well. And this partnership should know about. We really want to know where the good practice is. I want to know that. And so definitely reach out. And if you have ideas and thoughts listening to this presentation about this work and about the toolkit, by all means, this is a two-way street. We want to know about that. So please reach out to Guddy, but also to my office, because we want to know where the great practice is. And I guess the second thing is, if you're wondering, well, how do you do all of this? That's what I would be thinking, is, you know, the toolkit is such a great opportunity to bring partners together at a local level. And this is what we used to do at Standing Together, which is where I worked before, you know, in an operational group, to say, where are we with some of these things? How can we get this done? Who is missing from the table that we need to bring in and have part of these conversations? And let's just pick and choose and decide. We may not be able to do this all at once, but let's get started on something. What is something that we really need to improve and do right now? And I always think that's the most pragmatic approach, because we can really be held back by not thinking we can do it all at once. And of course, this partnership is really the culmination of many, many years of work, lots of different real specialists. And now we've got the gift of a toolkit to kind of fast forward progress in other areas. So I would just say thank you again to the whole team. Let's get to it. I'll do my part, and I hope you'll do yours too. So thank you, Guddy, for letting me say a few words, and I'm happy to participate in the panel as well.
Thank you so much, Nicole. I just love that in terms of bringing it together and making it really practical for local areas, because you're absolutely right. That's what I would be sat there thinking too. So thank you so much for that. I'm going to invite all the panel members to now. Thank you for waiting so patiently for the last part. Rosie, it's lovely to see your face. And Alan and Julia and Mariah, hi. And I know going last is always the last thing, and I've literally been sat here on tenterhooks being like, I want to make sure that we do this justice. So I'm going to get straight to it, no messing around. In terms of the whole house, and I know other people have got questions that they've sent through, but we were just going to focus in on two that we found. So in terms of the local authority perspective, Alan, what do you see as the key role of the local authority in delivering the whole housing approach?
Thanks very much, Guddy, and good afternoon to everybody. I think for me, the key item is that the local authorities have a consistent local presence within their communities. But I think given the current climate which we're all operating in, which is incredibly challenging for everybody with COVID and managing the virus situation, it's having that sort of broad understanding strategically and working very collaboratively with a range of partners to pool resources so that we're actually targeting it at the most appropriate areas to give people support, advice and assistance when they most need it. I think the other element about the whole housing project for me is how agile it is, and you can actually adapt that to different circumstances and different geographical challenges. So we're all working in slightly different environments. And I think that there is a flexibility within the whole housing project to pick and choose what elements work best within each of your localities. And finally, I suppose from a Stockton perspective, I think there's sort of three key things for me. One is about maintaining the accessibility of services so that however people access assistance or support, the people that pick up those calls either can deal directly with those people or they can signpost them to appropriate services. Secondly, I think it's about continuity and quality of services so that we're continuing to meet those customer needs and demands. And I think finally, I think for me, it's understanding that domestic abuse doesn't discriminate, and actually domestic abuse occurs, you know, not to one particular agenda. It doesn't discriminate in terms of sexuality or minority, community group, or even age. So I think it's the challenge for me going forward is how do we reach out to some of those groups that at the moment are perhaps underrepresented in the statistics. So how do we reach out to those people and tailor services to better sort of meet their needs?
Thanks, Alan, and that actually provides a really good segue over. I'm gonna pick on you, Mari, in terms of accessibility, and then maybe go back to Julia and then come to you, Rosie, so I make sure that everyone has a chance to speak, okay? But Mari, in terms of accessibility and Stonewall housing and your expertise, it would be great to hear more from your perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're correct. Was it Alan? In terms of the domestic abuse doesn't discriminate, and particularly, but services do, and that's the issue here. That the abuse doesn't discriminate. The abuse, it occurs in all different populations, but services aren't designed for all different populations. If we look at the experiences of trans women, for example, between 31 and 50% of trans women experience domestic violence, yet there are no specific trans feminine refuges in the UK at the moment. Yet we know that there's significant risk of violence for trans people. I think that the idea of the whole housing approach is fantastic. I think where it falls down for minority communities is around choice and the specification of services. So there aren't all those spikes on the wheel for LGBT people. There might be one spike. There may be a male refuge. There may be some private rented. There isn't necessarily that wraparound support, and I think that's really where we need to think about how do we make sure services are more diverse. I think thinking about how, if we're offering a housing first model, how might we make that more LGBT affirmative? And that can be through, engaging with LGBT specific services. It doesn't necessarily need to be an LGBT specific housing first model. It's about bringing in that expertise to make sure that the services wrap around those people who are experiencing abuse more effectively.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I'm actually, is it all right, Julia? I know can I pass over to Rosie right now, because I know you will probably have, and then come over to you, Julia, in terms of your experiences at the Angie Centre.
Yeah, I completely agree with Mara about agencies can discriminate, but also what I'd say is that DA domestic abuse, and actually we wouldn't separate domestic abuse from many of the people we support, because they face a spectrum of forms of abuse. So we often term that violence against women and girls. So we would say about how often that structural inequality and those intersecting inequalities can further discriminate against some people as well. In the work that we do around Black minoritized women, we find that women are discriminated against based on race, gender, but also the forms of violence that they've experienced as well, which are not recognised by mainstream services. And therefore the safety and recovery needs are not recognised by mainstream services. So I think we're going to talk about the duties and about some of the changes to the MHCLG. So I'll leave it there for now, but completely agree with Mari, but I think we really have to think about structural inequalities too when we're dealing with this.
Yeah, absolutely. And Julia, in terms of your perspective, the role of the local authority in delivering the whole housing approach.
Yeah, so we've been very lucky to have the whole housing project running in Cambridgeshire and Peterborough for the past, nearly 2 years now, and had elements of that, like the funding for sanctuary schemes, mobile advocacy, flexible funding. And I think it's picking up on some of the things Alan said as well, and Mari and Rosie as well, around there's not sort of one fit for any one local authority area. It's looking at what the individual needs are and where the gaps might be, and what elements of the whole housing toolkit are going to be useful and what elements are going to be helpful within that as well. And I think we're in a really good position at the moment to try and move this forward, with the domestic abuse bill coming through the Parliament, and local authorities will be undertaking needs assessments as well, which will hopefully pick up a lot of the issues that Rosie and Mari talked about as well, and identify where we do need to target some of that support as well. I mean, we really recognise the importance of housing for all victims of domestic abuse across that whole spectrum, and it is about making sure that it is a service. We have services that can meet the individual needs of people, rather than badging them into certain sets. and not concentrating just on one form of housing support. We tend to concentrate quite a lot on refuge accommodation, but in an ideal world, we would love that victims are able to stay safely in their own homes, and that there wouldn't be a need for them to flee as well. So it's looking at all those elements of the housing project to work out how we can best work in partnership, I think is the key thing as well, with all of our local services and all of our local agencies to move that forward. And I think we're in a good position at the moment to start having a lot of those conversations.
Okay, Rosie, you kind of circled that. That's really helpful, Julia. You kind of circled around what this new statutory duty needs to do in terms of exactly like what you were saying. So I just want to bring you in. I don't have to say the whole sentence.
I mean, we really welcome the inclusion of specialist services within the new MHCLG duties. For the first time, we're going to actually be in a position to be at the table, you know, part of the decision-making processes, or hopefully we will be. Whereas before we've been largely excluded, that is Black and minoritized specialist services have largely been excluded. If you consider that many of us are not commissioned and we're not tapped into that kind of work. My only concern is whether those duties are going to have teeth. So how are they going to be enforced at a local authority level? And also for us, where specialist led by enforced services have been excluded for so long, there's a lot of work to redress the imbalances. So we need to look at, this needs to be kind of resource led, and we need to look at those structural inequalities. But I think what I'd be really, really hopeful of is that local authorities are going to use this as a way to better implement their public sector equality duties, because I think now is the time to use that tool in terms of taking forward a lot of this gender. Very quickly, I'll just bring in stuff around the domestic abuse bill, because this is really important, especially in relation to housing. We know that migrant women and women without recourse to public funds are excluded from the bill. Now, what we've got to think about is how that is going to impact on statutory services and housing services, even when they want to help and support women. And if I tell you that 70% of the women we have referred to our services are externally, when they're externally referred, are seen to have no recourse to public funds, but actually 70% of them do, because either they're on spouse visas or they have other forms of access. You can see the level of discrimination that many women are going to face when they actually should be supported. And we're going to have a bit of an unholy storm there in terms of local authorities knowing how to respond to the needs of victims. On a positive front, I think for me, in terms of moving forward, we really need to think about competence and expertise. Yeah, so that means really thinking about those public sector equality duties, how they're enforced at a local level, and how we're working together to make sure we implement them. We need to think about those partnerships, accountability and scrutiny around the inclusion of Black and minoritized and excluded and marginalized organisations as well. Training and awareness. Look at the disaggregated data as well. Look at the evidence base about who we're providing for. I think somebody mentioned that before. And also, I just want to really quickly bring in, we've got quite an innovative partnership at the minute with an organisation called Tyne Housing up in the northeast. Now, we provide 30 bed spaces at the minute for women in crisis, but we also provide move-on accommodation. So that scope of how we work with different agencies and partnerships who have that housing expertise, whilst we work with our specialism, is really important.
I couldn't agree more, Rosie. Thank you for highlighting so much in literally seconds. We've literally got 1 more minute, and Nicole, obviously the domestic abuse bill, I know your priorities, you set them out in terms of migrant women and all of that work that's happening. So I'm not going to do closing remarks, because I think everyone's done a wonderful job of saying everything. I just wondered, Nicole, if you wanted to say anything at the end.
I think I would just wholeheartedly agree with all of what the panelists said, and particularly what Rosie said in a lot of those closing remarks. I guess what I would say is, for all of you listening, we all can have an effect on that bill. You know, the bill is still at a Lords stage. So if we all reach out to our MPs, if you happen to know people who are in the House of Lords, that's great too. But it's really important, put it on your to-do lists today, this week, to reach out and talk about how the bill could be improved. It could be improved to extend our statutory duty for the whole of the whole housing approach, and for our community-based services and migrant women. There's still time for that. We should be pushing for that now. So I think it's great that the tier 1 board that will implement the housing based, you know, as it is now, will really have these discussions. And if I were in a position of a tier 1 board, I would be bringing people like Rosie and the Angelou Center and Mari and others in to be really informing our approach and thinking about this planning. But we could do even better than that if the bill would do better and actually extend the duty further. So I would just leave that as a parting call to action for us all, and also just do everything you can to implement this toolkit that you've got. It's just a huge gift in terms of, you know, very rarely do you have such a well thought through source of information shared with you at no cost. It's all learning. It's an incredible gift, and it really shows, you know, our next kind of phase in thinking about change and innovation and systems change that we need in this country, and we need a lot more of it. So thank you so much to you, Guddy, and to all the partners again.
Thank you so much, all of you. I mean, I couldn't have said it better myself, and that's why I passed it over. I'm sick of my own voice as well. Thanks for everyone that stayed on till the very end. We're still up to over 250 people hearing that. And yeah, please go away, fill out the feedback forms that are going to come. Please tell us about what you're doing in your local areas. We really want to hear from you as well. And just thank you so much for everyone that's participated in all of your comments. It just means a lot to us because you've given up your time as well. So have a lovely afternoon, everyone, and take care. Bye.